So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. It's nice to see our participants filing in. So today, our webinar is called After the Bow Tie, the Story Continues. And this is all about how to use the information from our bow ties to make some tangible risk reduction measures on site. So to introduce myself, my name is Belinda Beale, and I'm a senior risk consultant here at R for Risk, and I will be presenting today's webinar. So to give you a bit of a background on me, I'm a chemical and metallurgical engineer, and I've spent probably half my time in operations in mining, oil and gas, and the second half in risk management here at R for Risk. So the technical expertise that I've brought to the team is safety case and safety assessment preparation. I'm usually on those kind of projects. And through those, I've been able to do a lot of workshop facilitation as well as bow tie analysis. And to spice things up, I do some consequence modelling as well. So here's just a bit of an overview slide of the services that R for Risk offer. We are a risk management and process safety company that offer these kind of technical studies, process safety management, business risk management, as well as training on a lot of the technical kind of aspects that we do, such as HAZOP and LOPA. And we provide these services predominantly to our clients in Australia, but we have had some clients from overseas as well. So here is today's agenda that we're going to go through. First of all, we're going to go through a bit of an introduction around bow tie analysis, in case you're new to this type of risk management. We're going to go through a couple of chapters, I'll call them, on how we can create some tangible risk reduction efforts. So we've got our actions, we've got control management, performance monitoring, and communication. I'll do a bit of a wrap up and then we can have a Q&A session at the end. So you'll notice that there is a question option available for you to type in your questions at any time during this webinar, and they'll be collected and we can answer them at the end. There is also a chat option, so if we've got any technical difficulties, please let me know in the chat window. Right, let's get started. So, to get everyone on the same page, we'll start our story off with the basics of bow tie analysis. So bow ties turn traditional spreadsheet type risk assessments into a visual diagram, which makes the information much easier to read, navigate, and analyse. We've got a basic picture of a bow tie diagram on this slide, and you can see from the shape of it why it's called a bow tie diagram. But it's broken up into a couple of different parts. So we've got a left-hand side, which is mainly our hazards, causes, initiating events, whatever you'd like to call them. But these are the events that start the chain reaction. So these are the failures, such as an overfilling of a storage tank or corrosion or holing of pipework, stuff like that. We then have our center event or our major hazard event. But this is our loss of control event and is normally irreversible. So we can't put chemicals back into a tank. We can't put electricity back into cables. And then finally, we have our right-hand side, which are our consequences. So our loss of control event has occurred, and now we're just waiting to see what our consequences are. And we can define a lot of different consequences. So we'd mainly look at health and safety risks, but we can also look at business risks and environmental risks, anything you'd like to define. So in between, we have these little coloured boxes, which are our controls or our safeguards, barriers. Again, they have a lot of different names. But on the left-hand side, we have our preventative safeguards. So these should be the controls that prevent us from progressing to our centre event. And similarly, on the right-hand side, our consequence side, we have our mitigation safeguards. So these mitigate the severity of our consequences. If we're looking at something like fatality level consequences, if we've got the right safeguards in place, hopefully we'll just end up with injuries instead. So these diagrams are fantastic for displaying information because they demonstrate the links between all our causes, consequences, and controls. But what makes a good bow tie? Normally, I would describe these as unicorns because they are quite rare. Anyone can make a risk assessment look like a bow tie, but it's when you examine the details that you might find out it's a bit of a mule. So here are our qualities of a good bow tie that we recommend. It needs to be an accurate model of site risk. So does it truly reflect what is happening on site? Are those controls as effective as the bow tie says they are? And is this risk truly as high as we think it is? The last thing you want to do is to be basing all your risk reduction efforts on poor information. Secondly, it needs to be uncluttered. So the beauty of a bow tie is in its simplicity. So we do not need to clutter it with every single micro cause and control that we can think of. And we've got some examples of some not so good bow ties that are quite cluttered there. So look at combining causes where it makes sense. You can also look at splitting up a bow tie, maybe into more logical process areas or tasks, so unloading versus storage. Or you might want to look at maybe a general site-wide bow tie to capture some of those causes like weather events that could occur anywhere on site. It needs to be logical. So you should be able to follow a single cause to consequence line, and the sequence of events needs to make sense. So to do this, it helps to order the controls in their action sequence. So which controls are going to act on preventing our initiating event first? What's going to happen last? And finally, it needs to be clear. So you've no idea how many workshops I've been in where you read out a cause and everyone debates what it actually means. There should be no debate. It should be clear from the descriptions how the scenario occurs and how you've come to your final decisions. And this is especially true if you're trying to reject risks, because you need to provide a lot of justification in order to reject them. So following these basic rules, by the end of the workshop, you should have a register of great bow ties. But operators spend hundreds of hours putting together bow ties just to let them sit in a register and be dusted off in a couple of years' time. This is not only a huge waste of resources, but a great loss of information. Bow ties are an extremely powerful risk management tool when actually used effectively and not as a paperweight. So the information we can get from a bow tie includes the relative frequency for different causes. So what are our most likely causes? Where do we need to focus? The level of process control. Do we have a lot of control over our causes or consequences, or do we have some gaps? Are there areas where we have no control? Of course, we will get a list of controls so that we know where we need to focus on our maintenance efforts. We'll also get our list of consequences for emergency response scenarios. And often emergency response plans will have to be updated because you identify a new consequence. And finally, being a risk assessment, you'll of course get a risk rating. So you can get an idea of what's high risk, what's lower risk, and where they all sit in relativity to each other. But again, this is all just data. Bow ties are just a model. They give you information. Creating a bow tie does not actually change risk on site at all. It's how you use the information to make tangible decisions that will ultimately reduce your risk on site. And that is what we'll be discussing today. So we can use this information we get from the bow ties for prioritization and decision making for actions. So of course we want to focus on our high risks first. We need to manage our controls to reduce risk as well, because they're the actual things that are going to prevent our loss of control event. And to do that, we need to do some performance monitoring and set up assurance activities. And finally, we need to communicate all this great risk management information to our workforce to influence culture on site. Okay, starting with chapter 1, risk reduction actions. At the end of the workshops, you're going to have a whole lot of actions. In our experience, these are usually never to be spoken of again. However, the implementation of actions is one of the most effective methods for reducing risk on site. So, how do we do this? First, you need to be able to compile the action list so you know what you're doing. I mean, this can be hard in some cases depending on the software you're using. Then you need to assign responsibility to a person or role to get the action analysed or completed. If no one is responsible, nothing will get done, and of course, nothing will change. So our other recommendations include devising a system to categorise actions. With a long list of actions, it can be overwhelming to know where to start. So it helps to divide and conquer by devising some of these categories, and make sure that we're doing this based on SFARP kind of principles, or so far as reasonably practicable. We need to implement an action tracking and reporting system. So we need to track the status of our actions and show people that what they're doing is important. And this needs to be reported at an appropriate level of management. If they are high fatality level risks, we need to ensure that these actions are known to management to maintain the momentum for these actions to be completed. So I do have a bit of a process flow diagram here as to how you might achieve some of this. First of all, we have our list, extensive list normally of actions. We want to be able to break these down into our first category of whether they're just information kind of clarification actions, or whether we need to do something a bit more tangible, so control improvement or implementation. So once we've done that, we need to do a bit of a gut feel, yes or no. There are probably going to be actions in there that you go, we're never going to do. So do a bit of analysis and then get your rejection evidence for your SFARP demonstration. We then need to categorize our actions on resource intensity. Again, this is a SFARP principle. So are they just do type of actions versus are they going to be 10-year capital project type actions? Again, we can do a bit more of an analysis to make sure we've made the right decisions. And then finally, prioritize these actions based on risk. So we definitely want to be targeting our high risk bow tie scenarios versus our lower risk, or the causes that have no controls versus the causes that are well controlled. And finally, of course, add that to your action tracking and management programs. And again, these could be different depending on the resource intensity. And finally, don't undo all your efforts by not closing the loop. Make sure you update the bow ties with the outcomes of the action, analysis, or completion as you go to keep the bow ties current. If needed, make it a requirement of closing out the actions as a prompt. So this might be making your proposed actions current or rejecting some actions. but any changes you make will affect the risk calculations. So ensure that your risk is still tolerable after these updates, because you might end up rejecting all your actions and the risk is unchanged. So our next chapter is control management. One of the main outputs you need from the bow ties is your list of controls. And this is to ensure that you're managing all the right controls to prevent a loss of control event. A common downfall we see with operators is the use of critical and non-critical control categories. The idea with this is normally a good one, to try and show that you have a lot of controls but only really want to manage the critical ones. However, this is a false economy, especially if you're under the major hazard facility regulations, as the regulator expects you to manage all your controls in the same way, and no site has the resources to do that. So to counter this, we recommend only adding real controls to bow ties. And by that, we mean controls that actually have an action and an impact on the risk rather than maybe a slight influence. We also recommend defining these controls as major incident controls if you're under major hazard facility, safety case controls, likewise. Maybe you just want to call them bow tie controls. But at least if you term them this way, you can ensure that you have a clear scope on how to manage your different type of controls so that you're not managing that single slide in the induction pack. But how do we define our real controls? So we do this through control verification. And ultimately, this should be done during the workshop, but it also can be done after the workshop. So we have these 5 characteristics of a real control, and they are implemented. So of course the control needs to be there in the first place and fully implemented. It needs to be effective, so it must perform an action that will effectively stop the initiating event or mitigate the consequence. It must be reliable, so when we require it to act, we expect it to act and not fail. And auditable and monitored. So we must be able to have some kind of performance indicators or some data that we can measure to ascertain the health of our controls. So we need to ensure that the controls on the bow tie meet a standard level in these characteristics. And for older plants, I'd recommend a design review to ensure that the control functions. So your alarm set points, the design of things, your P&IDs, your spec sheets are all up to date. So our next tip is to develop ongoing monitoring. And we need to design these assurance tasks based on our performance indicators, which we'll discuss in the next chapter. So when we're doing our auditing and assurance to make sure that our controls are healthy, we want to it could be easier to group controls for data collection. So instead of having to do 100 relief device, relief valve audits, we can group them into a single relief device audit and only do it once. We then need to assign appropriate timing and priorities to these assurance tasks, and again, based on risk. So of course, we want to do more frequent assurance on the least reliable controls and also on our highest risk scenarios. And finally, we need to provide direction in our supporting documents as to what's good, what's bad. So personnel performing assurance activities need to know when a control has failed or about to, and what they need to do about it. Otherwise, they'll most likely do nothing. And in that case, we have a much greater risk of a loss of control event occurring. So, speaking of performance management, after our bow ties, we should have the relative risk of all scenarios as well as our list of controls. But do we actually know the health of these scenarios? So will our loss of control event occur tomorrow? Is it going to occur next year? In order to know this, or to estimate this, we need to set performance requirements and set up a performance monitoring program. So first of all, we set performance requirements, what we need the systems or controls to do. We then gather data through performance indicators and monitor that data. And finally, we analyze the trends to determine if the data we're getting is good or bad, whether it's trending well or not. So here are our tips for effective performance monitoring. The first thing to do is to perform a gap assessment on your performance indicators for controls and systems. So these are the things that you can actually measure. And to do that gap assessment, you need to go, well, what data can I accurately measure on site? And then what do I need to measure to determine the health of that control or system? If they align, that's fantastic. If they don't, you might need to invest in some better measurement systems. You then need to set performance indicators and standards to meet the bow tie assessment. So if your bow tie says that a certain control is supposedly 90% reliable, well, I then don't set my standard as I need an 80% passing rate on that control for reliability. I need to set it at 90 to ensure that I keep my bow tie model accurate. And finally, we should assign a role responsibility to own the risk for the bow ties. And this is the person that's accountable for reporting on the health of the scenarios and perhaps organising the assurance activities, making sure they're done, rather than the people on the ground performing the activities. So this person needs to be an appropriate level of management to own the type of risk, especially if it's fatality, something like that. I mean, you don't want the CEO owning everything. You need someone who is actually affected by the risk as the owner, so they feel responsible for it. You might need to have a technical specialist to support them as well, if perhaps they're not from an engineering background. And this is just to make sure that the decisions that are being made based on the assurance results are technically sound and will provide adequate risk management and reduction. Okay, so final chapter on communication. Bow ties are made to be a visual risk communication tool. So actually use them as one and communicate our major risks on site to our personnel to drive safer behaviour. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing is to integrate them into systems. Things like management of change. We can have prompts in there to make sure that people are looking at the appropriate bow ties and reviewing them. Also incorporate them into our training. So we might have specific process area training for operators, and we can use the bow tie to demonstrate the controls and the risks in that area. Similarly, for operating manuals and emergency management scenarios, if we want to, we might even put them into the maintenance system, just in case people are defeating controls, they know what effect that's going to have on the risk on site. Secondly, if we're asking people to use bow ties, we of course need to train them in how to interpret those bow ties. So make sure that the relevant people using these systems know how to read their bow ties and how to get the most out of the information that's on there. Next, and this might seem quite obvious, but they need to be in an accessible format for the people who need to use them and not locked away somewhere in a risk register with a single log on and no one knows how to use the system. So if that means a PDF data dump of bow tie reports, fantastic. As long as people can use them, you can keep your register well controlled, but put the bow ties in a format where normal personnel can access them. And finally, ensure that the bow ties are kept updated. So people aren't going to use a tool that they know is useless or has bad information. So if we want people to use them, we must make sure they're great bow ties to begin with and that they're continuously updated or as appropriate. So that's it. We've reached the end of our story. And in conclusion, the first thing you need to do is to create good bow ties. So remember to always aim for unicorns. But then make sure you reap all the benefits of your hard work and don't let your bow ties just collect dust by doing the following. So you need to complete your risk reduction actions. And that means assigning responsibility and reporting on them so that people know that they're important and you continue the momentum to get them completed. Then you need to set performance standards and indicators based on what is in your bow ties. So we need to make sure that our bow tie model is reflective of site and that we are monitoring our systems and controls. So we need to validate our controls. And as I mentioned, monitoring the effectiveness of them, because these are our strongest tools for actually preventing a loss of control event on site. And we need to ensure that our risk isn't increasing from controls slowly failing. And finally, you've gone to all the effort of creating the bow ties. So actually use the bow tie information to influence system changes and a safer culture on site. If you do all these simple things, your site should be operating happily ever after. The end. So thank you very much for all our participants in today's webinar. And I see we've got a couple of questions coming up, so we'll get to the Q&A. So feel free to again post any questions in the question chat and I'll do my best to answer them. I'll just leave this slide up in case you need any information. We do have another webinar coming up in July, and here's a list of our upcoming online training courses as well. So we do have our Risk for Risk website at the bottom, as well as our contact details if you'd like to contact us for any more information. Okay, so our first question is, the slides and recordings will be made available? Yes, they will. So they'll be up on our website, and so will the recording at the end of this workshop. Another question we have is, useful to distinguish safety critical elements from other control measures. Some of these other control measures can still reduce the risk significantly. Sorry, not really a question. Yes, well, you do have safety critical elements in your safety management system. So going through a safety case for MHF, you do need to identify which elements of the safety management system support your controls and, again, which might kind of influence them. a document management system has a great reach versus something like asset management, which is usually solely focused on engineering controls. Okay, we've got another one. Oops, sorry about that. Oh no. I'll just get my PowerPoint back up. Apologies. Maybe I won't. So other questions are, do we need to consider all bow tie controls as a performance standard? Not necessarily. So you will need you don't need an individual performance standard for each individual control. I would say that you can have overarching performance standards for, say groups of controls, or really it's your safety management system elements. So you can kind of break those down into, I've got my asset management, safety management system element, and then I've got standards for that, how I want my maintenance system to function. And then again, I might group my controls to say, oh, well, here's standards for my containment type controls, so my bunds and culverts and stuff like that. And here are my standards for maybe my pressure relief devices. So you don't need to go to the nth degree to define standards for a bursting disc versus a pressure safety valve and stuff like that. What factors affect the frequency of reviewing bow ties? So there can be regulatory standards, of course, if you're under major hazard facilities. And that is during your license period, depending on if that is 5 years or whether there's other conditions on that. But normally you would review your bow ties if you've had a major incident or a very close near miss. So you want to make sure that what's on your bow ties is now reflective of what's on site, and you maybe haven't missed a risk that you haven't previously identified. Of course, any major changes to plant or controls is another great time to review specific bow ties. But normally your greatest review of your entire register will occur if you're doing a safety case, which is usually every 5 years. Our next question is, since all controls are viewed the same by the regulator, should we then focus on just critical controls during a bow tie, since these sets of controls are what we focus on? Absolutely. Absolutely. So often you will see people say, oh, well, this is a critical control because, it's a very good engineering control. It's an alarm and trip function. And then they go, oh, but, we need the fitness for work procedure as well to make sure that operators are, turning up to work in a fit manner. Yes, that procedure has some influence on risk reduction, but you could say that if they were driving their car to work as well, that they need to be fit to drive on the road. So you really need to focus on the controls that are actually going to make a difference, because again, you could be perfectly fit for work and perfectly trained up as an operator, but you could just have a bad day, right? You could still make a mistake, and you could still defeat controls and have a loss of control event. So really the thing is to focus on those real controls by using those control characteristics to ensure that what you put on your bow ties will actually make a difference. Oh, wow, we've got a lot of questions here. Fantastic. From your experience, does the regulator frown upon classifying controls as active and passive versus critical and non-critical? Well, no, actually, I wouldn't say that, because the recent CCPS book on bow tie management, and it's only come out in the last couple of years, classifies controls as either an active or passive layer. And I suppose they're more characteristics of the controls. So whether you have an active control that you need people for, or if it's a trip kind of function, they're sort of active controls, whereas of course your passive controls just sort of sit there and do nothing, your pressure safety valves, your buns and stuff like that. So rather than critical or non-critical, I would see active and passive as a characteristic of those controls. So it would still be a, let's say, bow tie control, but it is an active type bow tie control, or it is a passive type bow tie control. Next question. Do we need to have two separate audits for bow ties and performance standards? You can do assurance activities in a lot of different ways. So performance standards, I kind of assume that you're looking at systems, because performance standards are really just telling you what's good and what's bad. You wouldn't actually do an audit of your standard per se. You would apply your standards to your systems. So you can do audits on bow ties, and this is more around your controls. So you would do, okay, I want to focus on this bow tie. I just want to focus on these controls or my supporting system. Whereas you could do an audit on all your containment type controls across all your bow ties. You then might want to do a system audit. So if you've got a safety management, business management system that you're using, you would then set performance standards for that. And you could just focus on what requirements of that system are going to affect certain bow ties, because of course this kind of comes in two parts, where you've got the controls that are actually doing the job, preventing the loss of control event, and then you've got the systems that are supporting those. So if you're maintaining your controls correctly, they're going to function. If you've got all your specification sheets for your controls in your document management system, that also assists the controls to function at the end of the day, because people can find information. So they are kind of two different types of audits. You can focus solely on your controls, and that will be kind of a lower level audit on the bow ties. But then you can focus on your system, your supporting system elements, to say, well, overall, is my supporting system performing well or not? Our next question is, you indicated bow ties are ideally unicorn, one consequence line, for an event that could result in fire explosion or toxic impact. If these can be presented well, what are the major downsides by presenting all three? Well, in actual fact, I'm sorry if it came across that way, but of course you can have multiple consequences on the same bow tie. You can have as many causes and consequences as you like, as long as it makes sense. But yes, if you've got certain materials or certain chemicals might have all three of those properties. So they could be flammable and explosive and then be toxic. So it makes sense to include all those consequences on a single bow tie. Similarly, if you've got a certain process area that has, I suppose, multiple chemicals, again, you could have flammable chemicals in there, you could have toxic chemicals in there, and basically a release from a pipe or a loss of containment from a storage tank is going to have a fire impact or a toxic impact. Then you can, of course, show those on the diagram. The only downside, I would say, if they have vastly different consequence impacts. So if you're going to say, oh, well, my fire is going to wipe out 20 people in this area, but it's only mildly toxic, so it might only affect 1 or 2 people, that can skew things. But I would definitely recommend having, if it's particularly if it's a loss of containment, having multiple consequences. If it's stuff like, oh, I've got to create a flammable atmosphere first, which is more of process issues and set points, then it's probably best to separate fire out. But otherwise, I've got no issues with that as long as it makes sense. Finally, do I have an opinion on including risk information such as risk ranking or LOPA results on bow ties? Do you think this adds value or does it add clutter? Definitely include risk ranking. You can include your LOPA results. I mean, a bow tie is basically a glorified LOPA. It's a combination of lots of different LOPAs. It depends what outcomes you want at the end of the day. So if you want to go fully qualitative, it might not make sense to have all those numbers in there. But if you want to do a fully quantitative bow tie, then absolutely include those results. And there are a lot of programs now where you can get a nice bow tie picture, but have all that data as almost metadata and hidden. So it doesn't actually clutter the picture for the people who need to use it. Who would typically be trained on how to use bow ties? So engineering, support, maintenance, and operations. Definitely engineering would need to know how to use bow ties because they're assessing the equipment or the major equipment that's in there, and they've got the greatest knowledge of the process as well. So they need to be able to identify risks and know what risks are out there. Operators are another great one, but again, maybe do that through operator manuals, or just they need to be aware of it rather than fully trained in it, I would say. And same for the maintenance personnel. They need to be aware that if they're defeating a fire system to take it out for maintenance, what effect is that going to have on the overall risk? Our regulator has complained that some bow ties are not granular enough. E.g. look at Bunce field tie with very high consequence. Have you ever linked bow ties to another tool, e.g. traditional LOPA or FMEA, to provide more detailed justification, with the bow tie providing higher level summary? Absolutely. Any kind of supporting information you can link a bow tie to. Again, it must be clear, you know, why you've made that decision on that cause, whether it's, you know, it's going to be a 1 in 10 year event based on blah, 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 or we're rejecting this cause because of blah, blah, blah. Providing that kind of information is invaluable because you can then go back to either your LOPA, your FMEA, you know, even, you know, LOPA guidelines. You know, normally I would go, okay, I've got this frequency based on site experience, you know, if it was just a gut feel in the room, or no, we base this on LOPA guidelines of, you know, drop frequencies of 1 per year or whatever it is. And especially if you're using consequence modeling to justify consequence impacts, definitely reference those. I think that's it for our questions. I'll just quickly check the chat. Oh, looks like I've answered all of them. All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. That'll be the end of our webinar. So be sure to check our website out for other webinar dates and training and any kind of ways we can support you in your risk management journey. So thank you everyone. I'll say goodbye.